even though we did a lot of affordable housing in the Bloomberg administration, it's sort of, now the topic du jour in the de Blasio administration. And Adam and I spend a lot of time reading the newspaper and saying, I got it wrong again. So this is a complicated topic, and what we've, you read a lot of different things about it. What we're hoping to do tonight is just kind of give you a basic primer on it.
So I'll start. I think we want to describe what affordable housing means to us and what it is, as opposed to what it isn't. And the first thing that I would say is that there are three features. It is government supported, it is thereby government regulated, and it is, very importantly, restricted to people based on their income, means tested, in other words. Affordable housing is not rent stabilized or rent controlled housing that isn't priced relative to a family's income. And why is that not? Rent stabilized and rent controlled housing, while low rent, doesn't really meet the need of providing housing for people of modest means. So we're gonna carve that whole category out and instead focus on these three main tools for producing affordable housing.
Okay, so the first one, government supported. What does that mean? The first thing is below market land. What that tends to mean is wherever you have city-owned land or government-owned land where you can avoid a purchase price, that is a good place to start for affordable housing. So when Mayor Bloomberg came into office, we had thousands and thousands of vacant sites in the city still. It was just beginning to revitalize neighborhoods that had really just dealt with massive disinvestment in the 70s and 80s. So we were able to do requests for proposals to affordable housing developers for selling sites for $1. That is more complicated now because we used up a lot of the land. There's still some land left, but the other key is, and this is why you often find that most affordable housing is not built in Soho and Chelsea. You're going to go look for where land is cheaper on the market, because that's how you're going to make it work financially.
Okay, so related to that, no matter where you build affordable housing as we're defining it, means tested, government regulated, affordable housing, there is always going to be a gap between what the private marketplace, meaning the commercial marketplace, commercial lenders, commercial investors will be able to finance and still have the property be affordable. So no matter what you do, you're going to have to supply a chunk of the financing. You borrow as much as you can, you raise as much equity as you can, and we'll talk about the tools to do that. But there is still a gap, no matter how much, between the cost of producing the housing and what the revenue from the housing will provide in order to provide return to investors and pay interest on a loan. And that's where possibly the single most important tool, and one that separates New York from the next 50 municipalities combined, is the ability to provide a gap loan. When I started working in this field 27 years ago today, the government supplied 100% of that cost. So in other words, the loan, or the affordable housing loan, was the entire source of funds for the project. When Mayor Bloomberg started in 2001, that loan was down to about 67% of the total cost of the project. Today, on a good day, it's 30%. So think about that in terms of policy, and there are implications to that we'll talk about later, but in terms of policy, you, the taxpayer, are getting a lot more housing for your tax dollar. Next, real property in the United States is taxed, and there are a variety of forms of that tax. The simplest ones are what we refer to as property taxes, and obviously if you're paying property tax, but the government is also subsidizing through a loan, why would one do that? You would exempt that property from property tax, because otherwise you have less revenue to go borrow money from the private marketplace, and the government is simply going to have to make a bigger loan. So it's like squeezing a balloon. In our city, in our state, we also have other forms of tax. When you borrow, You record that mortgage, you pay a tax on that. When you transfer properties, when you sell, for instance, even that property that the city conveys, sells to a private developer, not-for-profit developer in my case, you pay a tax. So exempting those, relieving those properties from taxation is one way to produce, one lever the government has to produce affordable housing.
Land use and zoning incentives. This is another tool that the government uses to support affordable housing. New York has long had an inclusionary zoning program. It started just in Manhattan, really in kind of the most dense areas. As Vishon said, under Mayor Bloomberg, we expanded that to a voluntary program that hit some of the hotter market areas like Williamsburg, like Chelsea. And now, under de Blasio, there's a mandatory program that's being extended even further in rezonings. So that is the main tool, but there are other certain land use incentives that can also be used to try to get affordable housing. And then the last piece, tenant rental assistance. This really gets layered on top of all of those other programs that go to the developer. This is the ability for a tenant to actually afford that rent. So when you have those low-income level tenants that you're serving, they will only be paying a certain part of their income toward it, and the difference between what they can pay and what the rent is comes through rental assistance, the most common program being the Section 8 program, which is administered by HUD.
But just a little footnote on that, it is that is not a financing tool. That enables people to pay rent that the private marketplace has already, for housing the private marketplace has already produced. From the standpoint of financing, if your tenant doesn't have enough money to pay the rent, but gets a voucher to pay you, but can take that voucher and go elsewhere, your lender, your investor, your government lender even is going to say, not really something I can finance. When we talk about the city's affordable housing program, the current deputy commissioner overseeing development of housing, affordable housing, uses the term, we're buying affordability. And that's actually what the city is doing by providing their assistance in the form of tax relief, in the form of zoning bonuses, in the form of cheap loans, very, very cheap loans. What they get back is a regulatory agreement that says, I, Adam, promise to keep this property affordable to households earning this, 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 and this for this many years.
Right, so they get the agreement. It also, there's a lot of restrictions. Obviously, if the government's going to give you all of these loans and other benefits, we define the tenant incomes, the rent increases, how much distributions can go to owners, meaning how much money they can take out from cash flow, and then the government can monitor and default on those owners if they're not holding up their end of the deal.
And usually that agreement is limited for term. There's a lot of discussion about the notion of permanent affordability. And I don't think anyone in the affordable housing community resists that, save for the notion that real estate taxes will come into play at a certain point. And you can't go from charging $600 a month in rent, having your rent regulated permanently, but wake up one day 40 years from now and all of a sudden you have to pay real estate taxes.
So usually the term of years for the affordability matches whatever the benefit was. And so in the case of mortgages, that's often 30 years. In the case of a tax benefit, that'll be
40, 50, or 60 years.
The reason why inclusionary housing is usually required to be permanent is because that zoning benefit you got, that extra density, is there forever. And so in exchange for that, government says, that's there forever, you can keep it affordable forever. And then the last element is income restricted. This is, as Adam said, a means testing where you really have to hit very specific income targets in order to qualify for the affordable housing that is government supported and regulated. Tenants' incomes must be below those established caps. Those caps can vary depending on the program. The most common program that most affordable housing here in New York is built under are the low-income housing tax credit program. That caps incomes at 60% of area median income. Area median income is a calculation that HUD does that sets what the income is. There's a lot of conversation about what that is. HUD's income looks at the metropolitan area. So oftentimes you'll be building a building in, let's say, East Harlem, and the neighborhood will say, why is that the AMI? That's not what people in my neighborhood are making. This is a nationally set formula, and so it often is artificially escalated because of the large area in which it's captured. The reason why it is captured in that larger area is really that's how you have stable financing. It would be very difficult to administer the program on a smaller basis.
But it is also a mobility issue. We're building housing for people all across New York City. And I am sympathetic, and we do currently, so long as it remains legal, give preferences to local community members. But the irony is, of course, that folks in the community are typically already housed. And we have real trouble, honestly, meeting our community preferences, even despite getting 1,000 applicants per apartment. It is very, very difficult to find folks who find enough folks living in the exact community. Whereas observing an area median income allows someone who's, let's say, underhoused, living in Corona, Queens, to move to a building we've built in the Bronx. And that's kind of a healthier dynamic. I often say that I don't build affordable housing, I harmonize conflicting governmental regulations. And only in the best way. The notion of measuring people's incomes is one that has evolved very much. It used to be, and Holly will talk about it when we talk about public housing, but it used to be that your individual income was what we measured. Today, provided you can get a statistical average, in this case, a median, meaning the midpoint, not the mean, not the average, not the arithmetic mean. And we make sure that you will be paying no more than 30% of that mean. We can establish bands. We can have folks be a little bit rent poor when they move in, but with that regulatory agreement, they tend, not in every case, but there will be a tendency for people's incomes to rise faster than the rent, and that builds wealth. And that's the point of affordable housing. We neglected to say it's the thing everyone here spends most. You spend more of your money on it than anything else you spend money on. Just think if your income were more constrained. You're spending 50 and 60% of your household income on rent or on housing yourself.
So the last point is that, and I think sometimes this comes as a surprise to people, incomes are generally only measured upon your initial occupancy. So if you're that 60% when you're applying for your apartment, you aren't necessarily going to then get kicked out of your apartment if you get a promotion. The exception for that is that in public housing, which here is administered by the New York City Housing Authority, or for rental assistance if you have a Section 8 voucher, you do actually have to income certify annually. That does not necessarily mean that you lose your benefit or your public housing unit, but you do actually have to certify what your income is each year. So, quick note on public housing.
Okay, so the difference between affordable housing and public housing really is a portion of affordable housing, but the important difference is that it is government owned, government operated. As Holly mentioned, it's entirely financed by government. It was a very novel and progressive notion of the New Deal, I think was the sort of the era. Tenants will pay no more than 30% of their individual incomes, and you can see how it's difficult if you want to grow your model without 100% government financing. How do you go to a lender and say, hey, I'd like to borrow money to build my building, but if my tenant's income goes down, I'm going to have less money to pay you. It becomes an unsustainable sort of approach from a financing and growth standpoint. And to make up that gap, when tenants' incomes change, the government funds an operating subsidy to public housing. I think Holly can probably speak to this better. It is a very, very difficult, very challenged stock of housing. It's a model that is unfortunately, in some regards, out of favor in Congress, and you don't see much more public housing in the United States. What you do see is...
Right, I mean, public housing to me is one of the most fascinating aspects of my job because everywhere in the country, The housing stock is kind of at an age where it's really deteriorated if it hasn't been rehabbed, but at the same time, in the last decade, Congress has grossly underfunded public housing. There have been sort of different programs to try to deal with that. Hope 6 was a big one in the 90s, where they basically gave funding to cities to knock their public housing down and then rebuild mixed income housing. That did not curry favor here in New York. New York is very attached to its traditional public housing. So our public housing is in pretty bad shape, as I'm sure you know. The trend now, the program that has replaced Hope 6 under Secretary Donovan, who was my former boss twice, is called the Rental Assistance Demonstration. And the idea there is that because we're not getting new money from Congress, we're actually shifting public housing from the Public Housing Fund, which is plummeting, to Section 8, which is stable or rising. And it enables, they get this long-term Section 8 contract, different than the voucher program that Adam was talking about. People can't take their vouchers and leave. The assistance is attached to their units.
It has borrowed some of the features of private affordable housing in terms of rent setting, in terms of financing, and it is a more sustainable model.
Right. One of the keys that makes it different than traditional Section 8, though, is that it has the same tenant rights as public housing and retains permanent affordability. You cannot get out of your contract at the end of your contract. It automatically renews so that the housing will stay permanent forever. Okay, so you're about to see the difference between Adam's brain and my brain. We both decided that we would sort of do our own, so how does this all sum up slide. This is mine. This is how I think about how affordable housing gets built. You get your cheap land, you bring in the private capital that you get through investor equity and loans. You add in your public subsidies in the form of bonds, in the form of cash, as Adam said. You usually have a gap in there, and you get some sort of tax relief, and that is the formula that puts it together. Or, if you are a little more boring, you can look at it like this.
I tried to make these pigs, but I couldn't actually accomplish it. I simply wanted to show you the balance between sources, where the money comes from, the sources of funds, and the uses of funds to build a typical 100-unit building, which incidentally costs about $30 million. And in terms of the uses, in terms of the sources, as I said earlier, about 30% come in the form of these long-term loans, really, that they're essentially grants, they're renewable loans. 65% of the project comes from a very, very valuable tool that Holly mentioned earlier. It's known as the low-income housing tax credit, and we can talk ad infinitum, ad nauseum, about the low-income credit, but it is...
Grab a bourbon before you have that conversation.
It's very technical, but the important thing to realize is that for $1 of foregone revenue, the federal government gets, in today's market in New York, in excess of $1.20 of investor capital. And that investor puts his capital in, he gets only an after-tax return, no cash flow, and then at the end, he gives the building to, after 15 years, he gives the building to essentially the sponsor of the project. They get it's typically banks that invest in this. They get a regulatory benefit as well, sort of a good guy benefit under the Community Reinvestment Act. But as you can see, it pays for 65% of the cost of the building, and then the developer puts in 5% or so of his own cash. In terms of uses, that same $30 million, about 20% of it goes to paying interest on the construction loan, and that's right, a million fees of various kinds. 70% of it is the hard cost of construction, obviously the biggest. Sometimes that, for affordable housing, that's a pretty right number. That number goes up for market rate housing. We build typically, our buildings today cost about $250 per square foot to build. That's a metric that probably is half or less than half of the typical concrete buildings that you'll see going up in Manhattan or downtown Brooklyn or downtown Long Island City. And these days we can't get free land. It's hard to find. But you can see if you're paying for land, obviously you need more sources. we try to buy property that may be in a district that was manufacturing a long time ago. But manufacturing has since left. That use is antiquated. It's cheek by jowl with other bedroom communities in the South Bronx, East New York, Far Rockaway, Queens. And because we are community partners, we attend I too believe in the process. We attend those hundreds of meetings, and we get that property rezoned to, in essence, create value. And it's important to mention that a lot of that involves environmental justice and environmental remediation. We've done our 15th or 16th New York State brownfield cleanup. And it is important to note that the environmental laws make some of that very much possible in the world we live in.
So how do we build more affordable housing? Always the question. First, maximizing the use of public land. We talked about that. There's not a ton of public land that's vacant left in New York. One of the resources that's being looked at much more aggressively is NYCHA land, where there's the towers in the park and there's extra floor area ratio there. So I think we're going to see more and more use of that land for both affordable and mixed income housing. And then we've already talked ad nauseum about changing zoning, but that's a huge strategy that's being used in the de Blasio administration to enable new affordable housing in places that are pretty low density now.
The city's real estate tax policy is actually a regressive tax on renters. Renters pay a disproportionate share of the burden. It's treated as investment property, whereas homeownership doesn't. And we are a rental town. And there are other very many technical tweaks that can be applied to the real estate tax policy of the city to incentivize affordable housing, to give incentives, in essence, tax incentives for rent-stabilized owners to convert their properties from ones like Sci-Town is a good example, where the rents are naturally low. Upon turnover, that unit gets income regulated. So that really there's price regulation with regard to income, not without regard to income. The federal tax credit program is one that can be made much more flexible. There is actually a bill in the Senate now, sponsored by Senator Cantwell of Washington and our own Chuck Schumer, that instead of creating a ceiling of 60%, let's say, of area median income, it allows for an average. And thus, we can house more households at extremely low incomes, people on public assistance, or at 40%, which is really at the very bleeding edge of working poor, and households at 80% of income who currently go begging. They show up, and it kills my staff to send someone who's making $60,000 for a household of 4 and say, you are too wealthy to qualify for affordable housing. And then finally,
last one, obvious, commit more money. And what does that mean? As Adam said, New York City is so far off the charts in both the Bloomberg administration, the de Blasio administration, back to the Koch administration, in how much public money is committed to affordable housing. There's just no place that even comes close to that. And that's particularly necessary as the federal government has not been committing so much money to many urban things, but definitely to a lot of the housing programs. And then the last thing, we just kind of wanted to touch on some of the big questions that we often get asked and hear about. Does new affordable housing gentrify neighborhoods? Gentrification seems to be sort of one of those words that you hear and see everywhere now. I think that's a complicated question. One of the things that we often find ourselves talking about is the fact that in most places where you have apartment buildings with more than 4 units, you have rent stabilization, you have rent control. That protects tenants who are there now. So the places where this becomes a bigger question of are you going to be displacing people are in places that have very small housing with 1 or 2 family homes where maybe they're renting one of them, because those fall out of those programs. And so those are the neighborhoods where I think we really have to have focused strategies to prevent displacement. The other issue that I think is very real, and I think one of the questions earlier came to it, is businesses. It's much harder to protect businesses because there really isn't the same kind of regulatory framework in businesses as there is in housing.
Are we losing more affordable housing than we're adding? The reality is yes. The march of a raging, the evil twin of a raging market is rising rents. And the only cure for that is supply driven. You will see equilibrium price go up so long as demand moves up. And if you fail to produce supply, and I think we would both agree that, and I'm sort of slipping into the last bullet, it is impossible to think of a solution that is solely bound within the 5 boroughs of New York City. People move, creating mobility for people to move within a region, beyond a region even. I'm happy when one of our tenants gets rent rich, 8 years living, has worked hard, I don't need to measure their incomes, and has built a nest egg like a generation before did, like my grandparents did before them, and says, you know what, I'm buying a house in Yonkers. I'm buying a house in Portchester. I'm buying a house in New Jersey. That is a great day for me. And that resource gets recycled to the next, principally immigrant family, moving here to New York to make sure that we don't become Aspen. So I think the regional solution is essential.
Yeah, and there aren't a lot of tools for regional thinking and planning and governance, unfortunately. But one of the fascinating parts about this current job for me, having worked so much just in New York City, is now I'm working a lot in Yonkers. I'm working upstate, and there are so many resources. We live in the western part of the Bronx. 2 more stops is Yonkers, and there is a ton of housing at a completely different price point there than there is in New York. And I think as a government body, we need to think more broadly, and certainly I think even as people we do. I did a big how to find an affordable housing panel with the borough president in the Bronx, and it was packed. There were so many people there. And I talked to, they all lived in the Bronx, and I talked to them, have you ever looked in Yonkers? Have you looked in White Plains? Have you looked? I mean, it hadn't even crossed their mind. It was like, they had just won the lottery to think of, I could get on the wait list for the Yonkers Housing Authority and the New Rochelle Housing Authority and not be, 191,000 people ahead of me in the NYCHA pipeline. And I think these are the kinds of things, somewhat to Vishwan's of starting to think a little bit more broadly that we're going to have to think about in terms of affordability.
Thank you.